bit today about when accessibility isn't so easy and you have website features that need a little bit of extra love and attention. So to start out with, my name is Rich Lawson. I'm an Associate Director of Technology at Evolving Web. You can see my contact information there. Unfortunately, Suzanne Dergacheva is not able to join me today. We were going to both be presenting, so I'm just going to run through everything here. So yeah, we'll get started. But before we dig into the presentation itself, I wanted to mention that Evolving Web is a full-service digital agency that supports government clients along with a number of different verticals, and we're proud of our open source roots. So you can see there that we're a full-service agency that we specialize in Drupal, Platinum Certified Drupal Partner, Partner of the Year with Pantheon this year. We also are part of the Drupal CMS leadership team. Suzanne actually is part of the marketing initiative, and we've also been involved with going through and doing, leading on the track for analytics. And then, we've been doing a lot of training of Drupalists, and we're also organizers of the Evolve Digital Series. So we actually have that coming up in New York. You can take a picture, grab the QR code if you're interested. It has a number of different tracks. There's some Drupal focus on as part of it, but it's really great. A number of different people getting together. We just had one in Montreal. I think we had close to 40 speakers and a number of different tracks. All right. So in terms of accessibility, one of the things that we want to do at Evolving Web is we want to make sure that we're proactively reviewing accessibility. So we're not just wanting to make sure that we're meeting WCAG 2.2 AA guidelines. We want to make genuinely usable experiences for everyone. And so to do that, we regularly use tools like Axe and DevTools, DubBot, SortSite, and SiteImprove. But using these tools during development and QA generally uncovers issues too late in the process. So it's important for us to plan for features that require accessibility work up front. And then that way we have a sense of, okay, what's going to require a little bit more attention to make sure that it is going to be accessible. And really we can involve everybody in that process, right? It doesn't have to just be developers and QA folks. It can be designers, project managers, strategists, just the entire team, cross-functional. So in addition to all of those tools that I mentioned, being a part of the development process, we also do accessibility reviews during the design phase to make sure that what we're going to be delivering will be correct. There are some complexities there, right? So even with that initial planning, you can run into situations in which the accessibility testing that you're doing and remediation really starts to have a negative impact on your scope because you're spending so much time getting it right. So that makes it really important to be aware of those features that require extra attention. And so that's what I'm going to be talking today a lot about in this talk. So if you really don't have time on a project, these are the things that you can either de-scope or just make sure that you are aware of, because accessibility is a hard requirement. You have to make sure everything's accessible. If you do undertake them, you are going to be prepared in advance to plan around it. In order to identify any workarounds or do any customization that you might need. So the very first, I'm going to talk about 12 different areas that we really focus in on. There's others as well, but these are some of these features that really need that attention. So the first one is mega menus. So today mega menus usually will include a lot more than just links, right? They can have headings, images, short blurbs. There can even be interactive elements within the mega menus. And so by adding those features, it makes it much richer, and the design of that experience can be really great. But it can also create challenges if the keyboard and screen reader experience isn't carefully planned. So for example, what can happen within the mega menu is that a user might not be able to get to all of the different content with the tab key if you're not properly managing the focus. It's also possible for a user to get stuck due to keyboard trap loops, especially if the tab index isn't being used correctly. And it's also possible for that user to lose track of where they are because the different menu sections aren't being announced clearly in a screen reader. So to make that mega menu accessible, some of what we do at Evolving Web is we make sure that we're applying a number of different techniques. So we make sure that all of the focusable elements inside the open menu, so like the links and the buttons and form fields that I mentioned, are reachable in a logical tab order. So you want that to be very sensical. We also use aria expanded equals true on the parent menu item to make sure that when the menu is open, that's identified. And we also have aria controls that reference the submenu container. We add aria hidden equals false whenever we move the focus into the first focusable area inside the panel, and we use keyboard listeners like these, listening for the escape key, for example, to make sure that users can get out of that loop. And so I'm going to try to show you here real quick. So one of the sites that we worked on is for the ROM. That's the Royal Ontario Museum. And you can see here, if I can get the mouse cursor, that this menu kind of demonstrates some of the different things that I was talking through in terms of yes, we do have some links, but we also have these other elements involved, and we want to make sure that like when I just hit the escape key, that the user is able to get out of that. All right. So drop downs. That's the second item. So when you have a top-level menu link, and you try to make it to where it both toggles and it acts as a hyperlink and it'll bring you to a separate page, that can create some tricky issues from an accessibility perspective. So when you have that dual functionality, it can create confusion for keyboard users. Because what's going to happen if I hit that enter key? Am I going to go somewhere else, or is it going to toggle the menu? It also creates inconsistent behavior, or it can, for screen readers, depending on how the markup is structured. And then it can also create issues with creating some difficulty in managing focus and aria states cleanly when there are multiple levels. So if you get a nested hierarchy, as an example. And so to solve for that at Evolving Web, one of the things that we do is we provide a clearer, more accessible experience by converting the parent menu item into a toggle with a roll of button, and then that way it is basically toggling that state, right, where the menu is either open or closed. And then we don't always do it this way, but depending on the situation, we'll often put the very first link in the drop-down menu. That will lead to the landing page for a section, and then that way it's very clear what's happening, and keyboard users and also screen reader users, it's just much more accessible that way. We also will use aria expanded equals false on the toggle button and update it to true when you open up the actual menu, so that's handled well. And we make sure that the submenu is hidden by default using either aria hidden equals true, or you could even use display none depending on the situation, and then reveal it when it opens up. So just making sure that that works correctly. And then we also place the focusable items within the drop-down in a logical tab order. So those tab orders are really important, like I was mentioning before with the mega menu. And we allow the keyboard-only navigation through all the items before returning the focus out of that to the parent. So using another example here, you can see our work with the University of Georgia Center. And so I'm going to go ahead and click through to that. And again, this kind of illustrates some of the items that I was saying, where, okay, this is the toggle, and then this is the, where you can get to the actual landing page for the section. Okay. Dynamic filters. So this is related to search. We really love to make search field dynamic for users by, dynamically updating content without having to reload the page. It feels faster, and it really gives a sense of exploration, in terms of the content by using the filters. But if you're, not making that accessible to screen readers, obviously you're going to have some accessibility issues. And the problem by default is that screen readers aren't going to automatically alert someone that something has changed on the page. So this is something that you have to watch out for. So what are some of the different issues that you can encounter in this situation? So you're dynamically updating the page as people are interacting with the filters. Users may not know that the filter selection did anything. If you're using a screen reader, for example. The results section may change visually, but not be announced to non-visual users. And without proper cues, users can feel disoriented or feel like, hey, this isn't working. This didn't do what I wanted it to do. And so some solutions for that are to add an ARIA live equals polite region around the content area that is getting updated. So for example, you could have your actual search results or the search count, where that announcement would be happening. And then after the filters are applied, you can also display a message like 12 results found and update that as the user is interacting with the filters that are part of the search. And then you can use a JavaScript trigger that will basically update the region as the request completes. And then you want to make sure that after you've got this all implemented, that you're actually testing the implementation with screen readers to make sure that the live region is actually being broadcast and being read out loud. So those are some things to take a look at, and you can see we use this on the GGC, the Georgia Gwinnett College interface. So custom select elements are another feature that we like to pay special attention to when it comes to accessibility. Designers really like them, right? Because it allows for the, like if the project is calling for a more branded or a polished look, designers love to use these sorts of menus. But as soon as you move away from the native controls like the select elements, JavaScript replacements for that can present a lot of accessibility issues and challenges. So what we want to do is we want to watch out for the fact that even though you're moving away from an accessibility perspective, by moving away from that native element, you're gaining in terms of the design elements and also able to make sure that it's accessible. So what can happen with these is that they can break keyboard navigation depending on what library you use. So that could be the tabbing, it could be the arrow keys, it could also be whether or not the escape key is supported if it's not fully implemented within the library. It can also lack proper screen reader support, especially for focus announcements and selection changes and open and close states. And it can also trap users inside the field and make it to where the focus is not going to end up being correct. So the solution for Evolving Web in a lot of cases is to use the library select 2 that you see there. And what we do is we basically use that, its accessibility modes, including its ARIA support and its keyboard navigation patterns. So those are really, really helpful. And then we customize the behavior where we need to. And so that makes sure, like, what are we doing when we do that? We're making sure that the focus of the appropriate element after a selection is made is correct, and that assistive tech is announcing everything correctly. And again, there's a lot of manual testing involved with this to where, we want to catch any of the edge cases. And so, in this case, we found a good library where the defaults make a lot of sense, but depending on the implementation and exactly what is going into, based on the designs into this implementation, we have to take a look, we have to account for any of those edge cases that appear. Modal light boxes. So when we're showcasing visual content like photo galleries or product views or exhibition highlights, designers often will really want to rely on modals and light boxes to create a more immersive experience for users that are going to the site. And while these interactions look really great, they can easily become accessibility barriers if, you're not paying attention to a lot of these things that we're talking about, like particularly with keyboard and screen readers. So what kinds of things can you run into with a light box or a modal? Again, there can be issues with getting trapped. in this situation, it could be because of the background content still being focusable. And so then what ends up happening is you think you're working within the modal, like when you're tabbing through, but you actually end up interacting with some of that background content, and that's not good. It can also be that these libraries will not appropriately provide ARIA roles and labels so that screen readers are not understanding that you're within this modal context. And they can also fail to provide intuitive ways to close the modal with the keyboard. So, there can be a number of different issues. And so what we do is we use a tool called Parvus, P-A-R-V-U-S, and that's a customizable JavaScript lightbox. If a modal is used to display content or a menu in particular, we want to make sure that we're using that custom modal with JavaScript. Some things that we will do with Parvus. So even similar to what I had said before, you can still run into some different issues. And so what we'll make sure of is that we've got a role of dialogue and an ARIA modal set to true in the modal container itself, so that screen readers know that that's what should be getting the user's attention. And we also make sure that the modal includes that labeled close button. So that, we'll use something like close modal, for example, so it's very descriptive and users will know exactly what's happening and what will happen when they interact with it. And then we also hide the background content from screen readers using ARIA hidden equals true, so whenever the modal is active. And that alleviates that problem of getting stuck in the background. So an example of this is with the Royal Ontario Museum site. You can see here that if I scroll down and take a look at these different museum elements, I can go ahead and scroll through using my, I'm just using the arrow key here. I can also tab through, and then when I hit escape, I'm able to get out of it. So just kind of a quick demonstration of some of these techniques that we use. All right. So next up, we have looping sliders. Which I need to read. Let me show you on here. All right. So sliders and carousels are often used to highlight featured content. Those could be placed in heroes or in product showcases. But when using libraries like we will use Swiper.js, again, we can encounter some issues with accessibility. Users can get trapped inside the slider with no way to escape. And so that's not a good situation for them to be in. Issues that we see with libraries like Swiper.js include duplicate slide elements will remain in the DOM and are focusable even if they're not visible. So for example, like with Swiper, its default mode is to basically duplicate the slides to create infinite scrolling. And so you end up getting more and more of those, and so it creates an infinite loop. And then, that creates a keyboard trap, and you're just tabbing over and over, and you can't get out. So the solution that we use is we actually will go through and set the tab index to -1 on all of the non-visible slides for visible users, so that we basically will remove anything that isn't supposed to be visible, from the tab order. And then we detect side changes using Swiper's event listeners. So one example would be on-slide change. And what we're able to do with that is we can update the focusable elements in real time. So that's really good. And it ensures that the visible slides are keyboard reachable, and users can tab forward to content outside of it, so that's their means of escape. We also test the slider using real content, particularly, like this is a very simple example, right, where it's just images, but you can end up with more complex examples, like where, let's say you have a CTA or other interactive elements within the slides. You want to make sure that all of that will work correctly, because if you just use a simple example and your use case is a lot more complex, that's not a good situation to be in. So then, moving into maps a little bit. So SVG maps can be really visually rich, and they're a clickable way to help users to explore content. especially when you're dealing with, let's say, regional directories or filtering tools. But when maps are used as enhancements rather than essential navigation tools, they can create accessibility issues because you're, basically not spending the time on those that you would need to make them fully accessible. So things that we encounter with SVG maps are that they can often contain a lot of different interactive regions that need proper ARIA labeling and keyboard support. So it makes it a heavy lift. And then they're not inherently keyboard navigable, and so you have to do a lot of scripting to make them interactive and compatible with screen readers. And so what do we do to solve for this sort of a situation? What we can do is, we can actually hide the map from assistive technologies using ARIA hidden equals true or similar techniques if it's not essential. And I'm going to show you an example of that. And we also will provide a fully accessible alternative such as structured lists and dropdowns. So I think that an actual visual example of this will help. So if we scroll down here and we take a look at this map, you can see here that as I interact, so I've got my full list of results. But then as I interact with the map as a filter, it'll reduce the number of results because it's filtering the list. And it's also updating the filters over here. But this is non-essential, and so we end up hiding that from assistive technologies, and we make sure that it gives you everything that you need. You're able to interact with and filter the list, and you have the full content of your results, rather than having certain things that are only within, let's say, tooltips or something along those lines. So this solves for that issue because we're providing everything that's needed. We do have the nice visual there, but it's not necessary. All right, so then we also have search results, and really the default in our, from our experience is that we should be showing them as text by default. So I'm going to jump right into a demo of that on the Bonjour Quebec site. So you can see here that we have all of the different results showing up, and you can go through and filter that. But we're doing it, basically, they don't have to be text only. It can be, there can be some richness there. You can have images and other elements involved as well. But what we do is we actually add in the ability to see that on a map, and we clearly label that link so that you're getting the same list of results. But then this allows you to interact, from a map perspective as you want to go through and take a look at everything. And so that's what I'm really saying here is you can see the screenshot of what we just looked at, which is showing on the results on a map as an enhancement, and that clear labeling is basically to click that link that says to show the results on the map. All right, so maps, the ninth item here, from a content perspective, if you have a map that actually is content, then you have to make sure that you have a text alternative. And so again, I'm going to jump into a demo on the same site here. So you can see that for this particular tour, that if you go down here, that you can kind of follow the tour along, and you can click on and get a little bit of information here about this journey that you would take. So you actually have this, like all very visual and everything. But then over here, this is all, outlined and flows through in terms of exactly what would be involved in that tour. And we even have like the little added functionality here where as you're scrolling through, it highlights the different elements on the map that are applicable. But, from a screen reader perspective and an assistive technology perspective, you're getting everything that you need, and this journey is outlined for you. It's very rich, and you're able to step through everything. And so then that way, it makes it to where like we're providing all of that same information in a very accessible form. All right, so let's talk a little bit about iconography that is decorative. So anytime you have iconography that is just purely visual. It can be used to, like separate items on the page, or in this case, we actually have, and we're going to take a look at this in a minute or two, where we actually have labels next to the iconography. So these icons don't serve any purpose from an assistive technology perspective. And so what we want to do is that if those icons are image elements, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have alt equals blank or null, so that basically those are not being, they're not showing up as, from the assistive technology perspective. Because if you imagine that, like, let's say that I had a label on this, if I had alt text on this, that would be announced, right, along with the campsite. So it would be duplicative if I'm doing a good job with my labeling. And then one thing to keep in mind is that role presentation, role equals presentation, an attribute on the image, that's not as fully supported. It works in general, but it's a lot safer and a lot better to just use alt equals blank. And so that's the WCAG standard for that. I think that's actually also on W3C. So if it's an SVG instead of an image element, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use aria hidden equals true as an attribute, because that's the way that you would indicate that for SVGs. And then that way, again, it's not doing that duplicative announcement through a screen reader. So using this example here, if I scroll down, you're actually going to see this same example that I gave before, and you can see here that aria hidden equals true on that particular SVG. So yeah, it's a little hard to, I think I went down, there we go. So yeah, I had just right-clicked on, I think the campsites one, and so you can see that's exactly what we're doing there. All right, but so we've talked about iconography that's decorative, but you can also have iconography that is acting as content. And so that's another one of those features that we really want to flag and watch out for in terms of accessibility when we're building out projects. So icons are everywhere on modern sites. They can convey a lot of meaning very quickly, and they're great, from a visual design perspective. But anytime you're communicating important information through those icons, they become content and not just the decoration. So just to kind of stress that. And so then those icons have to be accessible. And so icons used as content, you want to make sure that they're labeled appropriately for screen readers and that they have meaningful descriptions. So we want to make sure that all of that is handled correctly. And then we want to make sure that it's structured also in such a way that content editors can easily manage them within the CMS. Because if you think about it from a decorative perspective, that might be worked into, like if you're building a component, it might be that, you just build in the iconography, or maybe you select from a few different options, very decorative. Whereas if you're actually building something that's content with these icons, it needs to be editable. It can't just be static. And then you want to avoid duplicating content or creating confusion with conflicting visual cues or even text cues. So in other words, like that's that issue we were talking about before, right, with the campsites where you don't want to have things be duplicative. But since it's content, it is needing to convey important information. And so what we do in order to make sure that these content icons are accessible is we want to make sure that we pair each icon with screen reader only text. So for example, like using this recipe here that we built out this functionality for the University of Georgia site. You want to, an example would be like gluten-free. Like you want to make sure that we're providing that text for the screen reader, and then using visually hidden HTML elements paired with that. And then we also want to allow, as I had said before, content editors to be able to edit these. And so they should be able to work with the text directly in the CMS, and it shouldn't be hard-coded. And then we also want to make sure that we're using ARIA roles so that the screen readers can interpret icons as labels and not just decorative graphics. So that's really our goal. And so when we implemented this for the University of Georgia, we implemented this solution for this restaurant menu where the icons communicate important dietary info, and they structure the markup is set up in such a way that the descriptive text and enabling of the editorial control in the CMS is all accessible and easily used by content editors. All right, dark mode. So this is something that has become, very popular as a design choice, for modern sites, websites. It can do things like reduce eye strain, support user preferences, and create, a really sleek aesthetic, as well as, it can be great for phones too, right? In terms of your battery, because, less brightness, saves battery a little bit. But anytime you enable dark mode, it adds this layer of complexity from an accessibility perspective, particularly when you're thinking about things like color contrast and focus visibility. And so, what you want to watch out for is that the color contrast will pass for both the light mode and the dark mode, especially on hover and focus, so the different states. And you also want to make sure that the focus indicators can disappear or become, you want to watch out for them disappearing or becoming too subtle. So I think a good example of that, if we look at the screenshots here, is, you've got this green or teal kind of color, and it shows up a lot better, I think, on the light mode than it does on the dark mode. And then, you also want to make sure that keyboard users aren't losing, they could be losing visual cues as part of that. So like when you're tabbing through, if your focus state is like a color that doesn't match with the color contrast ratio, then they end up running into some problems with that. So to solve for that, what we do is we test, in the different variations. So we're looking at all the different states. We look at the default state, hover, focus, and active, and we make sure that that works well in both light and dark modes. And we also make sure that we're using WCAG compliant color contrast ratios. So for text, like that link that I had mentioned there, we want to make sure it's 4.5 by 1. And then for any UI sorts of components like the borders and the outlines for like active states, for example, we want that to be 3 to 1. And then we will customize the styles as necessary to make sure that everything is really visible and shows up well. And so you can use a module called Dark Mode JS that Drupal has that makes it really easy to apply a dark mode, or pretty straightforward at least. And then what you're wanting to do is to account for all of these different, all of these different items to make sure that you're basically making sure that that dark mode site will be accessible, just like you would for the light mode. All right, so from a takeaways perspective, what we want to make sure to do is it's really important to do that proactive accessibility review. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure to start early. So like I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you can be thinking about this in design, and even when you're creating user stories, to make sure that you're capturing that and planning for that. And so you're starting really early. You're not waiting until you've gotten really deep into the development and gone down the rabbit hole in terms of spending a lot of time on it. You also want to plan for accommodations. So for example, if you know that there are certain things that you're going to have to do for low vision users and not just screen reader users, you want to account for that as part of your planning. You want to use a holistic cross-functional team approach. So this goes back to what I was saying before about not just developers and QA. Get designers, strategists, and project managers involved as well. Just make sure it's a whole team perspective that you're getting on it. And then you want to use you also want to not rely on accessibility tools alone. You want to make sure that you're identifying edge cases and issues through manual testing, because in certain cases that's the only way to really identify some of the issues that users will encounter in reality. And then on the project planning side of things, you don't want to use accessibility as a roadblock, but you want to be realistic about the implementation costs. And so what does that mean? That means you don't want to push, you don't want it to prevent you from, pushing forward with designs and other sorts of, you want to have nice functionality. You just want to be realistic about what that means for the project, because certain projects and certain, mandates will be a better fit for being a little bit more, kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. And then you want to add extra time for QA, quality assurance, and remediation of complex navigation and interactive features. So if you're building a map and like all of your functionality centers on that map, you know that because it's more complicated from an accessibility perspective, that you're going to have to spend a little bit more time on it, plan for it, and basically that's going to be key to being successful on the project. Great, and that is, so thanks everybody, and I thought we could have some QA. It'd be great to hear from people, like if there's accessibility challenges that you've encountered, we can talk that through, and or if you have any questions, I'd be happy to, engage with that. Hi, Maya.
Hi, I want to add something.
Mm-hmm.
We have a webinar tomorrow about accessibility. So if you want to learn even more, our co-founder Suzanne is hosting it together with Janelle Simmons from Harvard University. So if you're in, sorry, did you hear me? Because yeah, okay. Could you just have an evolving web?
Yeah, I can.
.com.
I will do that.
There's, I just want to show where you can sign up, even if you can make it because you're here, which is great. You get the recording later. So if you want to learn more about accessibility, I think that's a great way to.
Oh, of course I had to grab the one that has the. I'm just going to go to a different one. It's a little bit of a weird angle, so I'm going to just do that because finding that close probably.
Did you mention Evolve Digital?
I did. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
I was.
That's okay.
Good, and then.
Boy.
This
is what I had.
No.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, let me
You can.
find it. So if you just go to training and events, if you type in evolvingweb.com, there's the webinars page, and then you just click here on sign up. That's it. Very simple. Thank you, and sorry, now you may ask questions.
Thanks, Maya.
This might be a selfish question. You had on the icon content slide,
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was like CK Editor, you had some, you mentioned recipes that you created for like screen reader text.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, have you open sourced that? Is
Oh.
it a publicly available recipe or anything?
Yeah. So the question, just for the recording, is whether or not we've, in implementing the recipes for the University of Georgia, if that had been open source or anything. So it actually, if the actual content itself was a recipe, and so I don't know that like we have like an overarching tool. So I think that if you're following like all of the accessibility best practices, you can get there in terms of like the work that we had done. But yeah, it's not like a Drupal recipe like that will install something on site or put configuration in that will help you.
It looked like a CK Editor plugin or something.
Yeah, I think we were using an accessibility plugin for that one, and what I'll do is I'm going to post the notes, and I'll look that up, and I can include it in the content, the notes, speaker notes. Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, I have like two questions. The first question is, what I find myself doing a lot of times is trying to add accessibility after the fact to sites where significant portions of the functionality were like done by other people, and kind of getting in and making accessible is incredibly difficult, which is a very different use case than like saying I'm building from scratch. Do you have some history of doing that? Any advice about kind of how to move forward when you don't really have the option of saying which library I'm going to choose? I'm going to design for accessibility if it was already designed. Like particularly people who are like, oh, I'm just going to put tab index equals -1 on all of these elements so that nobody can actually reach anything on this page, and that way it's accessible. It's like, oh my God, no. So do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I will answer just for the recording. The question was about essentially if you are at a stage where things have already been developed, maybe you've inherited some functionality and it's been done very poorly from an accessibility perspective, how do you basically, what are some strategies to use to get that fixed and to work through those sorts of details? Obviously that's not ideal. But one of the things that can be helpful is to use like reporting, like if you do like a scan and you can use that as kind of a basis to start the conversation, and also prioritize in terms of like depending on how complex the functionality is, there can be some accessibility concerns that are more important or less important. So just kind of strategizing in terms of like what could be maybe backlogged for a little bit later versus what has to be tackled right away. But a lot of the times it ends up being a conversation on the team that like we need to make this accessible, and you end up in some cases I've had to go back and talk about like, okay, we designed it this way, we need this to be accessible, so what's the smart way to move forward? Can we tweak the design a little bit? A lot of it is specific to the particular implementation. But I think that communication and like gathering some information about what has gone wrong and some details is a good way to start that conversation and getting that resolved. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead.
Instead of Carvis.js,
Mm-hmm.
do you ever use the native dialogue element now that it's better supported? And then maybe more useful for like things like informational dialogues as opposed to like image boxes or something like that. Just curious if you ever use that.
Yeah, okay, so the question is using native dialogue instead of like some of these libraries. And so I personally have not used the native dialogue, but I think that is definitely something I will want to look into. I know that like with different solutions and also like with browser support, sometimes like we have to be careful about like when something is new, and even if it checks all the boxes, we have to be a little bit careful from that perspective. Yeah, I see you nodding. So yeah, so I think that that would be kind of the first thing I think I would check on, is just to see the cross-browser support on it and then go from there.
When it comes to implementing a library like Select2, which is one that I know we've used a lot in a lot of our sites, what is the most common 508 fixes, accessibility fixes for that you have to add in?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the most common 508 accessibility fixes that you have to add in? So I think that really what we've been seeing, and I don't know how to map it off the top of my head to specific, like 508 accessibility, like the actual issues or, like the protocols, but I think it's the ones that I had mentioned, right? So it's where it's duplicating, so like what you end up with is you end up with like a lot of hidden, like elements that are just being duplicated. Yeah, I think that's the main thing that we've encountered with that one. What about from your perspective, since you've used it a lot?
I noted the last time we had an issue with it.
Okay.
Like the entire thing got flagged for not being compliant, and so I was running around the web, and I found a fork of it.
Okay.
That had been completely redone
to
make it more accessible, and I've lost track of whether that's been folded back in.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure on that, but there's a good chance that is something that happened. I would hope that the maintainer would have taken that, since it solves so many different issues. But yeah, that's really good to know. But yeah, I mean, that's what we've mostly run into is just kind of having to do a little bit of tweaking with like the tab order with the -1, and for the non-visible elements, and then the visibility.
The tab order really hit us in a couple of situations where we had a bunch of them on the screen. But we fixed those.
Yeah.
But then another site came in, and it may have been some legacy code somewhere that was just an old copy. But it's like, wow, this has never happened before. Why is it suddenly such a problem?
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, so we've been successfully using it. So I think that probably got folded back in. So it's good. Anybody else? I think we're up at time about, but I could probably do one more if anybody else. No? All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. It's great.